So welcome.
Pilar, that
And,
was the name of it. Pilar. John Wayne's book, Pilar.
okay, after, oh, John Wayne, yes.
Yeah.
That was his
Big,
wife.
long, old yacht that used to be in Newport.
Newport Beach, yeah.
Yeah, one of his wives.
I thought Pilar was a gal in For
Hemingway.
Whom the Bell Tolls.
Right, but I'm pretty sure that was the name of the book.
Okay,
Definitely wasn't one.
I believe you. I
Can we
just,
get back on track here?
Yeah, let's do that.
All right, thank you all for braving the elements and getting out here. It's really been coming down. I think we got something like 3 inches today at least, according to my little rainbow. So thank you for coming, and I know it's going to be well worth your while. This is an extraordinary gentleman. He's an educator, of course, but this is a part of your history that I didn't know about. He was a Coast Guard sailor during World War II, and I think almost all of you understand that we're losing our World War II vets 400 a day.
Stop that.
400 a day.
That's not funny.
So you're, are you being silly? Anyway, Steve Stocks, he graduated from Compton High School, and he joined the Coast Guard when he was only 17 years old in 1943. He served 12 deployments in the Pacific War zones, and he was the 3rd class petty officer, radar man on the USS General Robert L. Housing. House. After earning how many degrees? 3 degrees, BS, MS, and MA from USC. I'm sorry about that, I was from UCLA. Steve was employed by the Oxnard High School District as a science teacher, then as a vice principal at Hueneme High School, then as a principal at Channel Islands High School and Oxnard High School, and assistant superintendent of the Oxnard Union High School District. So he doesn't know how to retire. He retires one time after 36 years in 1988. But then he was elected to the Board of Trustees of the Oxnard Union High School District, and he served as president for 5 years, vice president for 4 years, and as a member for 15 years. He retired for the 2nd time, and final time, at the age of 85 in 2010, with an impressive record of 60 years of dedicated service. I give you educator Steve Stocks.
Thank you. I'm really old school, so I don't have the fancy PowerPoint and all that sort of stuff, so we just kind of put together some information last night, and so I'll proceed. Briefly, she introduced you to me. I was born on the borderline between Utah and Idaho in a beautiful green valley called Cache Valley. Cache Valley was where the mountain men had their first rendezvous and where they cached their first set of furs, and therefore they named it Cache Valley. And that was in 1925. 2 years later, my parents moved to Compton, or to Southern California. We lived in Walnut Park, Linwood, and spent most of my young years in Compton, California. And from there, then I went into the United States Coast Guard. So briefly, that's what my background was. The Coast Guard originally was a cutter service. It was part of the Secretary of Treasury.
Revenue.
Who?
Revenue Service?
No. Anyway, in Washington's cabinet, they collected money. They were the tax collectors. Their little boats went out and collected money, and then they also were involved in life-saving. So they had various life-saving stations wherever the ships had a tough time coming in, and they had Ricky, maybe you can help me with some of the terminology, but they had most of the life-saving boats were not launched out of a harbor. They just went right through the breakers. So they had excellent training in launching boats through breakers and going out to save ships that were grounded. So that was called the life-saving boats. And in 1915, they amalgamated that and became the United States Coast Guard. And of course, they went back and said, we really got started in 1790. Coast Guard got started in 1915, is when it really got started. I think that, in my opinion, the Army got the best of everything. The Navy got the best of everything. The Marines got seconds, always got seconds. The Coast Guard got thirds. It was about the way it worked out. But their principal job during the war, as I saw it, was to transport people. You know, for every one guy that's got a rifle, there's 10 guys back here that are doing something to furnish a bullet for that rifle. And so we were to transport people and supplies. And then another part of the Coast Guard's routine was to go on submarine patrol, on convoys, and do all kinds of patrolling of taking ships back and forth. That's where the frigate men came in. They were really the transporters of convoys and so on. And then the third part was to man transports that would put soldiers and Marines on the beach. And the reason they were so adept at that is because they had all this early training up mostly in Alaska and up in the New England area where they had a lot of involvement in that type of a training. And so they had a good cadre of officers. Now when the war started, everybody was a rookie except the people in the regular Army or the regular Marines or the regular Coast Guard. So that was their cadre, and most of those people that were in the Navy were on battleships, were on cruisers, were on aircraft carriers. So we had a good supply of people that were able to man ships from their experience of manning the little cutters and so on. A typical cutter was about 337 feet long, was 41 feet wide, and it had 12.6 feet of depth that could travel in the water, and its top speed was 20 knots. Now wherever the fleet went, they always went at 20 knots. If you went, you know, you had to use your oil and be very careful about what you do. If you went up to 25 knots, you used a lot more fuel, and somebody had to bring that fuel all the way from Texas, all the way from California to fuel up your ship. So that was a typical Coast Guard type cutter, and they were named after various secretaries of treasury. They were a small boat that could turn real quick, weathered real well in the weather, and that was a large cutter. And there must have been a dozen of those around. Then there were some smaller ones, and then there were some others that were even smaller. What kind of a cutter did you serve on, Rick?
I was on 4 of them. The first one was a World War II throwaway from the Navy. It was, how big was it? Like 311. It had formerly been a seaplane tender in the South Pacific. Then my second one was another Navy throwaway. It was an icebreaker called Burton Island. These ships were of no good to the Navy, so that means the Coast Guard gets a new boat. The third one was relatively new, built in '67, and it was 210-foot class called Adventurous. My last one was one built in the '30s. It was the Campbell. It was the Coast Guard's most beautiful ship ever. The 237 feet. It was part of the Secretary class you mentioned, and it saw action in the North Atlantic in World War II. That was all 4 years.
Okay, well, I want to tell you about the ships. During my war, it was called a AK, Auxiliary Cargo. And it was one that brought stuff to the Pacific. And there were 15 of those manned by the Coast Guard. And then there was a AKA, Auxiliary Cargo Attack. They're the ones that had the Higgins boats. And they had the troops on board, and they went right into the beach. Well, of course, they dropped the Higgins boats off. The Marines or soldiers climbed down the rigging and got into the Higgins boats. They circled around for a while, and then they went into the beach. So there were AKs and AKAs. There were 5 AKAs, and most of those were throwaways again. They were old ships that the Navy said they were old liners. And the Navy said, they're not worthy. So, as Rick pointed out, the Coast Guard got them, and they were expendable. And then there were auxiliary ships that I was on. It was called an AP. And there were 22 APs. And the typical AP is this one right up here. That's what it looked like with the camouflage colors on. This is what it looked like down here when it was first commissioned. Had that dark gray on it. And if it ever got sunk, and none of them ever were sunk, but it had huge life rafts that were about as big as from this table down to the end of that other table, and we could save 1,200 people. The rest of you had to swim. And they had a thing they just pulled, and the life raft went right down into the water. And I'll tell you a little story. I was making some Applejack. I don't know what Applejack is, but I was making it, and I stored it in one of those things up there. The next time the ship got in port, they had to replace all the straps that were holding the ship, that were holding the life raft. And it's lucky that that life raft didn't give way while I was up there, because I'd have been out in the middle of the Pacific. I wondered whatever happened to that guy. And we're missing one life raft. I don't know about the Applejack part. Can you explain Applejack to me? This is participation class.
Oh, Applejack's a hooch made by the locals.
Okay. All right. We got that part down. Now there was the auxiliary personnel attack. They were called APAs, and there were 9 of those. That's where the old throwaways were. I might repeat myself. But they're the ones that had the Higgins boats and went right into the shore during the attack part. And then there were the Coast Guard cutters. They were the big cutters, and they were very maneuverable. They were great in cold, in foul weather, and there were 6 of those. And then there were ones that were called LCIs. They were landing craft infantry. They were about a 60-foot long boat, and they had long gangways that went down the side. And these boats probably had a crew of about 10 people on them. A coxswain, a motor mac, an ensign running them. And remember, everybody on these ships were all rookies. There were very few really people that knew what they were doing. So it's surprising how well we managed with 17-year-olds, 18-year-olds to make the world go round. And we manned 28 of those. And then there were the LSTs. They were a big old lumbering ship. Remember, the front of them opened up, and you could drive a tank out, you could drive a truck out, you could drive a Jeep out, you could drive anything else that you wanted, and you probably went into the shoreline. You probably dropped an anchor. I don't know much about it. You probably dropped an anchor way back here to help pull you back out into the deep water. And we manned 78 of those. And then there were the destroyer escorts. Now, a big destroyer is about 9,000 tons, and it takes a long way to turn. So the little destroyer escorts can turn real quick, real fast. So that was the primary purpose of a destroyer escort, was able to make a quick turn and go over to where they had a sounding from a submarine or whatever it was. And then we manned 75 patrol frigates. That's the frigate up there.
Oh,
And my brother served on that ship. It was the USS Glendale. He has 5 or 7 battle stars. I'm not sure which it is, but he has that many battle stars on his frigate. I'll tell you a little story about him. He probably weighed 175 pounds when he went on that frigate. When it finally came back to the States, he weighed about 125 pounds. They never ever got anything. Third class again. One time they were getting some supplies from some supply ship, and they stole, pilfered, or commandeered a big hunk of cheese. Big hunk of cheese. And it was the captain's cheese. They took it down into the bilges and hid it where the big drive shaft is that drives the propellers. That captain looked all over the ship. He was going to get his cheese. He never did get his cheese. But,
Like the strawberries.
pardon me?
Like the strawberries. Yeah.
Yeah, right. And anyway, so those were patrol frigates. And then they manned 19 vessels that were called AOGs. They hauled fuel, and they also hauled water. There was one, if you bombarded a shore installation, where are you going to get your water from? You have a big old tanker type ship come along, it's loaded with water. And then it goes back to Guam and gets another load of water and comes back again. So most of the shore bombardment just destroyed everything that was on the shore, so you had to either take it with you or do without. And so, and then they also had 8 corvettes. Corvettes were British ships. They were similar to the frigate. They were small and very maneuverable, and they could move around. And they had 4 sub-chasers. I don't know what the sub-chasers were. And then they had a miscellaneous of 13 other ships. So the Coast Guard manned 351 ships during the war. The Coast Guard really wasn't that big. I doubt that their maximum number of people in the Coast Guard was 400,000. I'm guessing more like 350,000. And so it was a small organization. So that's pretty much what that part of it was. I think that I wanted to tell you about a typical invasion plan. Let me see if I can find my information on a typical invasion plan.
right here.
Give me my glasses, will you? They're in my coat. This is the Hunter Liggett. That ship was built in 1921. It's one that the United States Navy said is not worthy. Coast Guard, it's your ship. And they turned it into an attack transport. Its captain was a guy named Perkins, and he was the commanding officer, and it was the AP-14. Now, if you look at the numbers of the ships, AP-14 meant there were 13 ships preceding that one. So this was a real early ship during the war. So if your ship was whatever it is and it's a 134, that means there's 133 of those made before yours came online. And the majority of the ships My ship, the AP, was 134. It came online in the middle of, can't remember, middle of 1943? In the middle of 1943. And I forget how many I told you there were, but anyway, this particular ship carried the flag officer, Admiral Lawrence Reisensnyder. He was the United States Navy Transport Group Amphibious Force South Pacific, and it was Coast Guard manned, and it led the entire formation of ships into the Guadalcanal invasion. And when it took the, it had, I think there were about 13 ships that went into Guadalcanal for the invasion, and the admiral on board was a Navy admiral, but the whole division was manned by Coast Guard ships that went in. And so the Hunter Liggett shot down about, it said it shot down 7 airplanes, and it was loaded with high octane gas, ammunition. It says right here, 3 Mitsubishi heavy bombers swept down, and the captain kept doing this and was able to save the ship, but a sister ship close by was sunk. And so he raided quite a few battle stars. He participated in a lot of activities, and that during that particular invasion there were 22 ships involved, and they were all under this particular admiral, and they were all Coast Guard manned. So that was the Hunter Liggett. Where'd I go with that? Here, pass the Hunter Liggett around.
Oh, okay.
Pass the Hunter Liggett around so people will look at it. The only first class ship we got was this one right here. This was built in 1931. It was called the Manhattan, and it had the speed record for crossing the Atlantic. It crossed the Atlantic in 5 days, 14 hours and 28 minutes. It was the fastest passenger liner that ever crossed the Atlantic at that particular time. It was converted into a troop ship. Now, if you remember during the war, there was a program called Lend-Lease, and we gave the British a bunch of old destroyers, and we took over some islands in the Caribbean. So we had some extra crews left around. So these extra crews got to man these ships that were derelicts. And so the Wakefield put a crew on, or the Coast Guard put a crew on the Wakefield, and it was called the AP-21. So there were 20 auxiliary personnel troop ships prior to the Wakefield. It loaded 6,000 Canadian soldiers on board. It went up to Nova Scotia. Now this was before the war started. It went through the Panama Canal, went all the way down to Singapore. The mighty base of Singapore was the major base for the British in the Far East. All the cannons pointed out to sea. The Japanese on bicycles came down the peninsula, came in the back door, and captured the Navy base. Along with it was 6,000 Canadian soldiers. Those soldiers are probably the guys that built the bridge over the River Kwai. Most of them died, but they were the labor. So anyway, the Wakefield, when it was in Singapore, that was, the Japanese found out that, I'm not sure, well, it was a British battleship. I don't remember the name of it.
Prince of Wales?
Might have been, but it was sunk. That was the death knell of the battleships. The bombers sunk the ship, and one bomb hit the Wakefield, and but the Wakefield survived that and got out of there and participated in the war the rest of the time. So that's the only first-class ship we had until they started making these others. But you know, you go to this thing here, that had a cheap motor in it. It really did. They went with what they had. That was probably the motor that drove that ship was 1920 vintage, but it was updated and made usable. Here's one. This is a modern ship, the Admiral Mail. The Admiral Mail was bigger than my ship. It had 2 stacks and it could haul 6,000 troops. And it was the, I forget what its number was, but if you remember a movie star named Victor Mature, he was the chief on the Admiral Mail. And when I got my vaccination in boot camp, a guy that was a movie actor, his name was Gig Young. And he shot me in the side. So Gig Young gave me my shot in the side. And I want you to look at the typical uniform, you know. That's the typical uniform here. Nowadays, hell, they got all these designer clothes guys to make a military guy look like who knows what. But in our stuff, most of our uniform was cut off. They weren't Levi's, they were just cut off cotton pants and a t-shirt. And usually went barefooted, I think. That's why I got all the skin cancer from that sort of thing.
How hot was it inside the thing?
Pardon me?
You didn't have any air conditioning, so how hot was it inside the hall?
Oh, you know, our room, our berth was back by the engine room. It was hotter than heck there. It really was hot. I always slept up on the deck. I stole a hammock, appropriated a hammock somewhere, and tied it up somewhere in one of the rigging, and I would sleep on. But I'll tell you, you had a nice little white yellow blanket with cotton, or not cotton, wool blanket with a stripe on it. It was cold in the tropics. You want to make sure you had that blanket over you because it got cold when the wind blew. And one night I was in that hammock and it was probably hanging up about where that picture was. The damn rope broke. Boom! Oh, my ankle. I'm in terrible shape. Crawled down the ladder, got down to the sick bay. Oh, it's okay now. Crawled back up the ladder. I don't know what I did then, but there were only 12 of us radar men. So if I went into sick bay, we were in short supply of help. So I went back to work. And anyway, another interesting thing is you served a watch. You were on watch for 4 hours, and then you were off for 8 hours. 4 hours on. That was just the regular watch. Every evening when it got dark, they would blow the tubes. Down in the engine room, they would, whatever the blow the tubes was, they'd get all the charcoal, all the stuff in the engine room, so it'd go out. So we went to general quarters every evening, and we went to general quarters every morning just at dawn. Those were the 2 critical times. So, but if you went to general quarters, you were on duty all the time. And but being on an auxiliary transport, we didn't go to general. You know, I was lucky. I had good duty. I went over, I got salty, I came back and said, I've been in the war zone. Where you civilians been? I got to kick around San Francisco for 2 weeks, learn how to drink. No, I had good stuff in those days. Went to the played football on top of the St. Regis, the fanciest hotel in San Francisco.
Really?
I can't remember what it was, but there was a bunch of us. We went up there, played football, went to the top of the Mark, went into the Admiral Dewey room at the St. Francis Hotel. All this brass was in here. I noticed all these guys over here with all their brass on. Sailors were just as good as the damn officers anytime. Anyway, I had a good time in San Francisco. Just to prove that, I'll let you start. Well, you started around. And don't look at it too long. You'll get the wrong impression of your father. Typically, that was one of those girls who would come up and would you take your picture and she'd charge you $2. And then you folks back home thought, oh hell, look at that. Steve and his girlfriend. You're studying that too hard. This is what I looked like when I was really
Wow.
cute.
You were very cute.
This way.
But you were some dancer.
You know, I really wasn't much of a dancer. I will tell you one other thing. This is all on the record, and the statute of limitations is long gone. We were out kicking, I went to boot camp in Government Island. It was a little island right in the middle of the Oakland estuary. And it had a long pier that you went into. And we'd go to that pier, start of the pier, we'd pull the fire alarm, and then we'd run like hell to get to the beach and get past the guards. And we kept doing that every time. Finally, they got tired of that, so they decided to catch us. So they caught most of us, but I was a fast runner, and I got away back onto the base without ever getting caught. But one night, as I said, the statute of limitations had passed. We went out and we found somebody's car. We went joyriding for a couple of hours, and then we got out of the car and left it. So, you didn't know that, did you? I enjoyed being in the service. I don't want to do it again, but I really enjoyed being in the service. And the part I loved the most was to go to the stern of the ship and watch the wake from the ship. We put out a big wake, and it'd be a mile long, and it would be fluorescent. And you could really see there. I had one Navy fellow tell me that on a ship, they have I forget the terminology. This is what happens when you're 93 years old. You take salt water and make it into fresh water. And when those machines break down, the only way you could launder your water was to put it in a bag, tie a rope on it, go to the fantail and throw it overboard. You'd drag it for 3 or 4 miles, then you'd bring it back on board and your clothes would be clean. So,
Stiff as a board.
pardon?
If it's stiff,
Oh, yeah.
we had to do that.
Taking a shower in salt water is really, really bad, yes.
When you were thinking of joining the service, what made you chose the Coast Guard?
Ask my question.
Okay, my brother, 17 years older than I was, he had a job, he was run a power plant for one of the Shell oil refineries. And everybody was patriotic, they really were patriotic. He went to the Navy and they said, you're too old. He went to the Coast Guard, they said, we'll take you. As a matter of fact, come right down tomorrow. They put him on a whale boat. The only weapon they had on the whale boat was a whale gun. You would go out to sea 400 miles and you patrol out there if you see the Japanese Navy coming, you telephone us. I mean, you telegraph us. And you're on your own. So we did that for 3 or 4 months. And I said, if it's good enough for him, it's good enough for me. So I joined the Coast Guard. Now I had 12 buddies. We're all about the same age. A couple of them are a little older. And 2 of us went in the Coast Guard. 3 or 4 of them went in the Marines, and the rest went into the Navy. One was a pilot in the Marines. And when he was a first pilot, he was a sergeant. You know, they wouldn't make a pilot. The Navy, most of the Navy pilots were chiefs, warrant officers. And so the Marines were also warrant officers or high-ranking chiefs. Later on, they commissioned them all commissions, but one of them threw a P-38. And so out of the 12, one became a paraplegic. He was a Marine, one of my early friends in the Battle of Pellew. And so he was in bad shape. The kid that was behind me, Alan Dix, joined the Coast Guard. He was 2 weeks behind me. I didn't even know he was on the base. He got killed. Of the 12 that joined the service, one was a Marine, paraplegic, one was a Coast Guardsman and got killed. The rest of us came home. So the Coast Guard really had a high casualty rate. But there weren't a lot of us there, so, you know, percentages mean that you can have a high casualty rate, but not a lot of them.
So what was the Coast Guard's role versus the Navy's role? When did they say, this is your job and this is the Navy's job?
Supplies. Bring the troops over. Bring the troops over. You know, I mentioned that transporting people and supplies, submarines, patrol convoy, and manning the attack transports. That was their primary role. Now I do have one thing. I'm a school teacher. I can call on somebody. I'm going to call on this lady right here to read this. Oh, okay. For that my textbook really was. I'll show you my textbook. This was written by a chief. A lot of the information I got came out of this. The ship at the top was the Admiral Mayo. That was the ship that could hold 6,000 troops. It was a freckle up from ours. But down here is a little article. That's me when I was a high school graduate. My other picture there is my brother, who was a chief. There's me in a white at Waikiki Beach. And there's my brother, who was a military police investigator. And down below is another picture of myself.
Well, the article was talking about your mother had 3 sons in the service.
Yeah.
Yes.
And you want to look at this over here. This is Japanese propaganda that came out of my little textbook. What the Japanese would tell you about surrendering. Primarily the emphasis was on the civilians back home are having good times with your wives and your girlfriends.
Yeah.
Take a good look at that. You'll find that quite interesting. Over here is a picture of what the typical crew looked like. I told you. You know, nothing fancy. Nothing fancy at all. This picture here is, we tied up at Goodenough Island. The captain was a chain smoker. Captain Baker. God, he smoked, I bet he smoked a carton of cigarettes. Took him 4 hours to get that ship. There were no tugboats there. You had to just back and forth, and he finally got tied up to a pier. it was a rickety old pier. You know, down the South Pacific, they didn't have good stuff down there. They were junk. And so he got tied up there. This is a coconut plantation. All the trees are in line, all in line. And that was a recreation place for the Marines. It was a little island just north of Guadalcanal, about 30 miles north of Guadalcanal. It's got a native name. Its American name is Russell Island. But just like a farmer that had all the coconut rows and rows.
Was your ship ever fired on?
Pardon me?
Was your ship ever fired on?
Well, they gave me a battle star. We've been in minefields. We've had a torpedo shoot at us. And they call them bed check Charlies in Lady Gulf. Japanese plane would fly over and see what was down there. And I don't know if he ever dropped anything. I think he just took photographs or something. But I got a battle star for that.
What kind of armament did your ship have?
Oh, okay. Well, we were well armed. We had 4 5-inch, they called 5.38s. They were in a gun turret. And they were pretty good. I don't know whether are you familiar with the 5.38s at all?
I know what a 5-inch gun is.
Was the shell, I don't know whether they put a powder in, put the shell in and then powder, or whether they just was all combined, shell and powder. But they could fire off pretty fast.
And you had anti-aircraft.
Well,
too?
then this picture right here is one of those BOFA Swedish. It was right above us. Man, did it make a clatter when it went off. We shot at more targets than we shot at airplanes. But I got a battle star, so I'm salty. And what else did you want me to? Oh, okay. I'm now, your turn.
Oh, okay.
Stand up, would you please?
This is an article that, when we go to Montana every year, and so there's the local newspapers called the Blackfoot Valley Dispatch. And I don't remember how he became aware of this, but the editor became aware about Steve's service and what had happened with Indianapolis, so he interviewed him, and this is what they wrote.
Well, the Indianapolis was the ship that carried the parts of the atomic bomb from wherever to Guam, or Tinian, I guess. And then the Indianapolis proceeded from Tinian to Lady Gulf. Now the fleet was forming in Lady Gulf, the Isle of Lady. All the fleet was gathering there, getting ready for the invasion. And so that was what was doing, and it was on its way to Lady. And we were 5 days behind it. And there's a road map. It's about 100 miles wide. And your ship is supposed to stay in that road map, and it goes, you know, wherever it goes. So you can go anywhere inside that road map. And so we were on that road map. At the time, we were going straight. We weren't zigzagging anymore. We were never in a convoy anymore. I've been in a lot of convoys. I'll tell you one interesting thing. One night we were in the convoy, and we were the convoy leader. We had a Commodore on board. Commodore has one stripe. There's not many Commodores around. But he was the head of the three, I think there were about 13 ships. And we were doing this. Every 20 minutes we'd change and go like this. Well, we went like this, and this guy, or we went like this, and this guy went like that. And from here to the front door was this ship right now. And I was on the bridge that night, on the wing of the bridge, and I could see the whites of their eyes. And you don't you don't stop a ship in 100 yards, a mile at least. You don't turn a ship. That's why they have the destroyer escorts and the patrol frigates and the corvettes. They can turn real fast. The destroyer takes a long way to turn.
Did
Anyway,
the Commodore have some kind of comment about that situation?
oh, damn.
Is that what he said?
I don't know.
So this is about Indianapolis, and there's a couple of these.
Let me clarify something. You were on the Indianapolis?
No, they were following
We were right behind it.
the Indianapolis. So the title is 73 years later, memories of a naval tragedy still linger. In 1942, Steve Stocks joined the Coast Guard at 17 years old. 4 months later, he was on a brand new fast transport headed to a base of operations on an island on the south end of New Guinea that had only recently been liberated. I went to an island called Goodenough Island on the southern end of New Guinea, Stock said. The Japanese had just been chased out of there by the Australians. The trip took 19 days. Over the course of the war, Stocks made similar trips a dozen times, carrying troops and equipment from the States to the South Pacific as part of the Coast Guard's often forgotten role in support of combat operations throughout the war. Sometimes we were one in a convoy, sometimes we went by ourselves, Stock said. In July 1945, as the U.S. was preparing for the invasion of Japan, Stocks was serving as a radar operator on the USS General R.L. Howe's AP-134, a Squire-class transport that could carry more than 3,500 troops. As they steamed toward Leyte in the Philippines, where the fleets were gathering ahead of the planned invasion, Stocks saw a sight that left an impression on him unlike any other. We were about 5 days behind the USS Indianapolis, he said. On July 26, the USS Indianapolis completed an historic mission, secret mission, delivering the enriched uranium and parts of the atomic bomb Little Boy to Tinian in the Marianas Islands. After a stop in Guam on July 28th to take on replacement sailors for those who had completed their tours of duty, the Indianapolis headed for Leyte. Stocks, who had a break from his radar job, found himself on the starboard wing of the bridge of the Howes at about 10 o'clock on August 3rd. I looked out into the water and I could see all these floating sailors. Some of them were probably Marines because the Indianapolis would have had a complement of Marines, Stock said. That was 73 years ago. I was 19 years old at the time. I saw all these dead bodies floating in the water. They were the crew of the USS Indianapolis. Just after midnight on July 30th, the Japanese submarine I-58 hit the USS Indianapolis with 2 torpedoes. The heavy cruiser sank within 12 minutes, taking almost 300 of the 1,195 crew members down with her. For the next 4 days, the sailors and Marines who made it off the ship suffered from exposure, thirst, salt poisoning from prolonged time in seawater, and most famously, shark attacks. 321 crew members were pulled from the water after a passing bomber spotted the wreckage August 2nd. Ultimately, only 316 survived what is still the largest loss of life from a single ship in the history of the U.S. Navy. Stock said a destroyer escort a mile or 2 away from the house, possibly the USS Cecil J. Doyle, the first ship to reach the survivors and the last to leave the area, used its signal lamp to tell them not to stop, but to get out of the area, which they did. Before we got to Leyte ourselves, the news came over the radio that the atomic bomb had been dropped, Stock said, adding that the rumor that went around the ship was that the bomb would ignite the nitrogen in the air and cause the atmosphere to explode. Stocks, who turned on 93 on August 4th, said that sight has stuck with him ever since. It was brought back as he read an article at the end of July, about the anniversary of the Indianapolis sinking.
Now, I have another article that tells about how those poor sailors, what they looked like. It's just gross to what happened to them.
I just finished that book 2 days ago. I happened to see it at the Oxnard Library, and it was put on the shelf. And I read the flap on the Indianapolis, and I thought it was very interesting reading. And when I read that book, it took 60 years. The captain was court-martialed for that. And the Navy intelligence made a mess. That ship was missing for 4 days, and it was actually spotted by a guy that was a navigator or a pilot, and it was lucky that he found the ship. But the story of that ship and how they were transporting that bomb, they took the bomb in different pieces and then they put it together at Tinian, and that's what led to the bombing. But how the Navy intelligence and the court-martial, it's quite a story. I really recommend that book highly. The author is a woman by the name of Laura Vincent. It's a fabulous story.
Yeah, I read the book.
It's very sad.
I read the book. It's very hard to read. You know, it's comparable to the one about Zambezi and the prison camps. It's quite hard to read, but very, very detailed on what happened. And the sad thing, of course, was that they were secret. And that's part of the reason nobody knew exactly where they were, and they hadn't given off their position, and so nobody knew where they were. And that's why it took so long to find them. But very tragic, that, especially when they survived. You know, they're alive in the water, and they could have easily been rescued, but you know, it took too long to get there, and so many died.
Yeah, I have a tribute to the bureaucratic baloney going on in Lady.
Yeah.
But you have to remember, we were all rookies. There were very few professionals during that war. Very few professionals. And so the people that were usually in shore stations, they were not real sailors. They were administrators. They were clerks. They were that type of personnel that was handling it.
The sad thing was how the Navy tried to cover it up.
Yeah.
When they court-martialed the captain. That was the terrible, terrible.
Right.
Yeah, he committed suicide afterwards.
Yeah.
And it was the Japanese sub-commander that they brought to the United States, and when they were
To testify against
court-martialing
him.
and when they were interpreting what the Japanese sub-commander was saying, they misinterpreted his answers
Yeah.
in the interpretation from Japanese to English. And it took 60 years. And the crew of the Indianapolis were doing all they can to fight for their captain.
Yeah.
And it took 60 years to finally get him exonerated.
But he also, though, had a lot of hate mail from the parents of the crew.
Right.
Now, I want to tell you about one other thing. In Montana, I have a good friend who served on in the submarines. And when the war was over with, they went into Tokyo. And I'll precede that for. I've been in almost every island there is. I've never been to Okinawa. I've never been to Palau. And I've never been to Tokyo. But I've been everywhere else in the South Pacific. I never even got to Australia. That would have been a good liberty, almost as good as San Francisco. But anyway, I've been in all those places. And so when the surrender was over with and they went into Tokyo, there were 4 large Japanese submarines, the largest submarines that were ever made at that time. They were capable of carrying airplanes. And I think they were the number was either 200 or 400. I can't remember what it was. But there were 4 of them. And they had on the books they were going to make 12 of them. One of the airplanes was to go to the Panama Canal and bomb the locks at the lock at the Panama Canal. The other airplane was to go around to New York and bomb New York. I don't know what good that would have done. But that was the mission of two of them. Now, they took all the sailors, all the airmen off of the 4 submarines, put them on the base in Tokyo, took the airplanes off, just left a crew on, left the Japanese crew on. They put an American crew on. What do you call an American crew that's in charge? Anyway, they're in charge of the no, they're just in charge of the ship. Anyway, they're in charge of the ship. And so that the Russians heard that we had these 4 Japanese ships. They wanted them. They wanted to get a look at them. They wanted whatever Russia wanted to do. So the Americans took the ships out and sank them to keep them from being taken over by the Russians, or at least letting the Russians get a piece of the action of it. So, you know, the only reason we're ahead in the space thing was we got the Germans signed this before the Russians got it, but they got some of them. So what they didn't get, the spies got for them, informed them of all of our stuff. So,
Just to add something on the Indianapolis, when the North Koreans took to Pueblo,
oh yeah,
intelligence gatherer,
uh-huh,
there were only 2 intelligence gatherers in the entire U.S. Navy at that point. Pueblo was one of them, and it had just been commissioned. When they took it, and they took it into Wonsan Harbor, the Russians were waiting for them at Wonsan Harbor because they had all this cryptographic gear on it.
oh yeah,
And they offered the Russians what they called the KW-27, which was like a master system for most of the Navy ships. And the Russians said, well, we already had it. And then that was one thing, because we got that. You know, the Russians are not very smart people. They're stupid. So what happened with the Pueblo was the Navy claimed that we had all the planes in South Korea had A-bombs on them. And they couldn't send the Air Force up. What the real story was is the whole fleet was down in the Gulf of Tonkin, and they had no way of protecting the ship. So that's why we didn't do anything. We just weren't ready. That was a big thing. The other thing is with the Coast Guard during Vietnam, they ran market time. Vietnam was divided up into different segments. And you went anywhere south of the DMZ into South Vietnam, all the like destroyers really along the coast were all Coast Guard. Further out to sea was the Navy, and most of the Navy ships were out in the Gulf of Tonkin.
mm-hmm.
And I always remember that. And then you got really close in, and then you had what they called swift boats and the
Oh yeah,
PBRs were in real close. But the Coast Guard had a lot going on in Vietnam, especially with market time.
well, as I've been doing my reading and research, the Coast Guard bringing troops to shore has been involved in North Africa, southern France, Normandy, all over the Pacific, and not very much that I know of up in Alaska though, and I'm sure they might have been there. But they've been involved in every invasion there has been during World War II that took place. So we did our fair share of.
Like I mentioned to you, I had that one relative that was coxswain on those Higgins boats. And most of those Higgins boats, he told me, were pretty much Coast Guard guys.
Yeah, I'll tell you one more story. When we invaded the Admiralty Islands, this American admiral who was in charge had these Coast Guard attack transports ready to go. I forget how many he had. Quite a number of them. And they were going into this particular bay. I think I don't know. They got all these South Pacific names that I can't even pronounce. So they were going in. So the admiral is sitting right here, and the navigator, the Coast Guard navigator, is right here, and the helmsman's right in the middle of the wheel. Now the helmsman, the Coast Guard navigator, he's probably a lieutenant. The admiral is a big stripe and couple on top of that, I'm sure. He's supposed to turn at such and such a point. The admiral tells the helmsman to turn. The navigator grabs the wheel and holds it. He holds it for 2 whole solid minutes. Now he's been in Alaska, and he has a good idea of distance, and he can really zero in on distances. And he holds it, and the admiral doesn't know what the heck to do. The guy's holding it, but then after 2 minutes, he releases it and tells the helmsman to turn. They go in it and they have a perfect landing. The next day, the admiral transfers to another ship. It's kind of like you're going from Motel 6 to Hilton or something. He goes on to go in a better ship. So he's not on the Motel 6 ship any longer. And he's sent for. What's going on? Marine comes and gets him, brings him into the wardroom, stands him in the door. The captain's in there, the admiral is in there, 2 or 3 generals, 2 or 3 captains. They're all drinking, having a good time, smiling and laughing. And he tells him to come on in. And he tells him that the next day they send somebody over there, and they found out there's this big reef. If they'd have turned at the particular time, they'd have gone ashore on that reef. So he got some good accommodations for his ability to hang fast.
Hey, Steve, I remember you told me about your taxi service for the guys who made it in March. You brought them home, that's what you said.
Oh, yeah, well, we've hauled, I think I got it on I have hauled, the first bunch of troops I took were 1st Cavalry. They didn't have their horses. They didn't even have their helicopters. They just had their rifles. That's the first group we took. It was probably 2 or 3 battalions to New Guinea. They served a lot in New Guinea. This is the 1st Marine Division. They were in that Russell Island. There was only 1,600 of them left. And we brought them home from the 1st Division Marines. So I have a fond place for them. This is a poppy that the British issued for Flanders Field, World War I. And I got that in Britain. The rest of this stuff, these are my campaign ribbons. I don't know what they are anymore. But I'm entitled to them. So, but there was a civilian prison camp. It was a Catholic monastery, a big Catholic compound. Espiritu Santos, I think is what it was called. And all the civilians, there were Australians, there were British, there were Americans, primarily Americans. They were all kept there by the Japanese. These poor guys were skin and bones. You know, you've seen pictures of the people in the German camps. Same type of people. We brought a whole bunch of them home. And when you're young, you should talk with those people. I just looked at them. I never ever really talked to them, but I should have talked to them. And in the next war, I'll really talk to them. So anyway,
So that was the civilian prison?
they were civilians.
I had an aunt in there. She was a missionary doctor they captured in China.
Well, these came out of the Philippines.
Yeah, she was put into the Philippines.
In your day, when you served, where did the officers come from? What schooling did they have? I mean, the Navy's officers all came out of the Naval Academy. Where did the officers from the Coast Guard come from?
There's a Coast Guard Academy,
Uh-huh.
and there are two academies that are run by the Coast Guard. One's on the Pacific Coast and one's on the Atlantic Coast, that train civilian officers for the maritime fleet. But we've given our maritime, because of insurance things, most of the maritime ships were all not American anymore. But during the war, if you were a first class something, whatever your rate was, you had experience, and they made you a lieutenant right off the bat. So most of them,
Field command.
yeah, I can't, there's a term for them. That's what happens when you get to be 93, you forget what these terms are. But there's a term, well, field commission, but there's a derogatory term for them.
Mustangs,
Pardon me?
Mustangs.
Yeah, Mustangs for one thing, but,
Why that? Why Mustang?
This is a name they had for the officers that had once been enlisted.
I'll tell you a kind of interesting thing. On a troop ship, way down, the bunks went about as high as that Port Hueneme sign. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. At least 9 high. And they were just a wire, this sort of stuff,
Right.
frame with a canvas in the middle, and that you climbed up there and went to sleep. And that's what you kind of slept on. And so you're in, all these bunks were like that. And then you come up one level and there would be probably a room 3 times as big as this, where the troops ate. And you got in line at 7 in the morning, at 9 o'clock you got to eat breakfast. And then you got out of line, and if the weather was bad, you went to the rail. And then you got back in line at 11 o'clock to eat again. You know, that was the routine. Then the next level up was the ship's company. Another room 3 times this size. That's where we ate. You went up another level, it's called the wardroom. That's where the officers were. Well, there was probably a wardroom for the military officers. And then there was a wardroom for the ship's officers. They had white linens, they had mess boys, they had tablecloths, they had silver, they had tea sets, you know, first class stuff all the way. And they had good food for a week. By that time, everything came out of the refrigerator, and it was powdered this, powdered that, dehydrated this, dehydrated that. I hardly ever ate breakfast. I was too busy trying to sleep. But, so, anyway, yes.
A number of years ago, not too long ago, 5 or 6 years ago, we took a cruise on Norwegian, and the cruise was the Hawaiian Islands. But in looking at the itinerary one day, I saw this port we were supposed to go, and they took us out there. It turned out it was part of or not far from the Tarawa Island. And the reason for this was that cruise ships, if they have to go to a port outside of the New York or Los Angeles or the United States. So we took this cruise in order to comply with the regulations. And we took this cruise from one of the islands of Hawaii, and it took us, most of the day to get out there. We just had lunch on this little island, and they said it was close to Tarawa. Is that near the Marshall Islands, or?
I think the Tarawa Islands are in the Carolinas. And now you bring that up, that's where we learn how to invade islands. Slaughter was terrible.
Fanning Island.
What was it?
Fanning Island.
Fanning, okay.
No. Is it-
Tarawa, anyway, Tarawa is where they had their first invasion. And they didn't have very good intelligence. So all the boats going in ran into all these coral reefs. And they had to dump the Marines out. And most of them were water up to here. And there was a ship over here, and the sharpshooters were just shooting the heck out of the, excuse me, poor Marines.
It was nicknamed Bloody Tarawa.
Yeah,
That's
that's where they learned how to do an invasion. They learned a lot from that. And so after that, they didn't make those kind of mistakes usually. But they still made a lot of mistakes. So,
Part of the Line Islands.
Rick,
What island?
The Line, L-I-N-E, Islands of the Central Pacific.
my friend Rick Manzer over here brought some of his stuff. Maybe you want to tell us what you have, Rick.
Oh, cool.
You brought over, Rick.
Well, at one time I had a little display case, and it was my old little Coast Guard museum. I was in the Coast Guard, I went in 1969. My brother was already in, he and I went in because our favorite TV show was Sea Hunt. So Lloyd Bridges would catch some bank robber out in the water, and the Coast Guard would show up in a spanking clean white boat, and the sailors would wear their dress uniforms while they took these crooks prisoner. So my brother and I thought that would be fun. So, and also there was this thing called Vietnam going on.
Right.
And so I was trying to decide what I was going to do in the military, if I was going to go or what I was going to do. And I went over to the lighthouse here. And at that time you could just drive up. So I just drove up. And it was a Saturday or Sunday. And I parked my car. I walked up to this door. And there was this guy sitting there. And he had a World War II Army coat, a green Army coat. And I could see that he was leaning back, he had his feet on the desk, and they were in flip-flops. And he had a BB gun, and he was shooting Pepsi cans off these rocks out the back door of the lighthouse. So I come in, I talk to him, he turns around, his name was Tom Gallegos, he lived in Santa Paula. And I wanted to know, is this the Coast Guard? And it looked fun to me. He said, this is the Coast Guard. And I said, I'm thinking maybe because I might get drafted, maybe I go in the Coast Guard. He said, well, I live in Santa Paula. At 4 o'clock I go home and I'm going to have dinner with my mom. He says, if you're in Vietnam at 4 o'clock, you're still peeking through the elephant grass. And I thought, well, this sounds more my style. So anyway, so over the years, I kind of collected Coast Guard stuff. What Steve was saying, how the Coast Guard, its uniform is basically the Navy uniform with little modifications. Like the Coast Guard had a little shield on the sleeve, a little white shield on the dark uniforms, a little navy blue shield on the white uniforms. But basically it was other branches of military stuff. So this is a Coast Guard woman's hat from her, I forget what they call this, but
Showing a wave.
yeah, she was, the Coast Guard women were called SPARS, which is Semper Paratus, Always Ready. And this was a woman in Ventura, her name's Dottie Bundy. I knew her and her husband. Her husband was Paul Bundy. She was a radio operator in San Diego. Her husband was a radio operator on a seaplane. And they would talk, because that's what they did, they were radio operators, back and forth. And he went into the radio station and he met her, and they married. I met them probably when I was in high school. Anyway, so I have Paul's ID and his dog tags. I have Dottie's hat. Let's see, what else do I have? There wasn't a whole lot that said Coast Guard on it, For example, this is a World War II era flashlight. found this on one of the old Coast Guard giveaway, the old ships the Navy gave us. So it was World War II vintage, and I've kept it ever since. This was from my era in the 60s. What else do I have? This is a helmet belonging to a Coast Guardsman. The light gray, which is this light gray, one guy told me this was what the color the Coast Guard and Navy painted their helmets in the Pacific and in the Atlantic and maybe in the Med. It was a darker gray. It's got a guy's name on the back. This guy might have been, yeah, this guy might have been a Higgins crewman, or he could have been like on that. He would have worn this helmet in general quarters. I'm thinking he put Coast Guard on it because when he took the boats, took the Marines and the soldiers to the beach, he wanted them to remember that the Coast Guard brought them, maybe. So mostly what you can get from World War II that was specifically Coast Guard. Well, here's Steve's brother's canteen. Steve gave me this. This is his brother's canteen. Basically, you associate these with the Marine Corps, which is the Marine Corps is the Navy's. I heard someone say the Navy's little sister.
Men's department.
That would make the Coast Guard like the stepsister of the Navy. So the fun. Oh, this is a Coast Guard, really interesting Coast Guard Good Conduct Medal from World War II. And after World War II, they went to one that is less sexy. So the things that I
Steve,
find.
you didn't have one of those good conduct medals, did you?
No. I wrote in jail once.
I think Steve told me he had to serve actually a full 4 years. A lot of guys in World War II, they went in, and like my dad went in 44 and he got out in 45. So my dad was only in the Navy about 18 months. So the Coast Guard grew to this big number, like Steve said, 400,000, and then almost immediately went back down to their current level, which is like 35 to 40,000. So the fun things that I've been able to find that were Coast Guard related were things you could get in the PX. So this is like a little, what they call a camera makeup case inside. Oh, and there's a letter in here that this guy that my mom and my aunt ran a grocery store here in Hueneme during the war called Aces. And so she would meet these, my mom was a looker, my aunt looked like the lady on the dollar coin, you know, all right? I can't remember her name, but my aunt was not a truck, but my mom looked like Miss California. And so here's a letter from a guy that met her here in Hueneme, and he was taking Higgins boat training in New River, North Carolina, which is basically Camp Lejeune, I think. So he was learning to run Higgins boats, and he sent this to my mom, and it's a little makeup case with a mirror in it.
How cute.
And then there's powder under there, and these little things that she could. Okay, so I thought that was fun.
What's the letter say?
Just saying. Well,
Yeah. We want some Inquirer stuff.
his name was Bud. Elmer Brown, Coast Guard Detachment, First Marine Division, New River, North Carolina. That's his mailing address. And dear Rosemary, first of all, congratulations on graduating from high school.
Oh my.
So this is June 3rd, 42. Hope you have a swell graduation and a very successful career. I know you will. I wanted to come and see you before I left, but they gave us so little time. It was just, you know, nice conversation.
Did he survive?
Don't know. So I Googled his name. I don't know where he was from. My mom also had a box of letters from guys that she met in World War II. And the first stack I got, I sorted them out by names. It was a guy named Ray Sprague. And so I read all his letters, and they just abruptly ended. I actually Googled his name, and he was an Army pilot, and he died in a training exercise at a base in England. But so I stopped reading these letters. I just got a little disappointed. So basically, the things that I've been able to find from World War II are basically paper, This is the Coast Guard document, how to transition from a sailor's life to civilian life. This is one to all the branches, but the Coast Guard's logo's on the back. Liberty passes, Coast Guard welfare, which would be like, I don't know. Well, what it was for us is if somebody in the Coast Guard needed money to go back to a family's funeral, Coast Guard welfare would help support that so you could get this plane ticket. This is a cigarette case with the Coast Guard logo on it. So you put your lucky stripes in here. And I store a lot of these papers in there. Really neat, these are a couple of things you buy at the PX. 2 Coast Guard belt buckles Coast Guard could put on his military belt on his dungarees. So I thought that was fun. And then I got these 3 things that are pretty interesting. This is Coast Guard. It shows a ship with a couple of small guns. This would be like the 327-foot class, like the one I was on last, World War II era. This is something you could get your sister. It's put like a sewing kit. It actually has Coast Guard logo, New London, Connecticut, and she could put like sewing kit in there. Here's a smaller one. So sister on, isn't that sweet? You know? And then last thing I got, because this is pretty interesting. Early in the war, we were concerned about, we had no military in California. So right after Pearl Harbor, they sent out a division, 35th Division came out here from Missouri. And they had just finished their Army infantry training, and they were going to go back. They loaded the ship on December 5th, and not the ship, they loaded the trains on December 5th to send these guys back to Missouri. And on December 8th, they churned all these trains and headed them out here to California. So one regiment, about 1,000 guys, was pretty much headquartered at the Ojai Valley Inn. They took over the golf course, actually built the airstrip there. The other military we had, because we were concerned about Japanese saboteurs, so on the West Coast and the East Coast, early on in the war, they recruited all these Coast Guard people, some of them on horse. They went to Montana to get cowboys. And they actually had these people patrolling the sand dunes 24 hours a day early on in the war. So these guys had very little training. They were Coast Guardsmen. They gave them a rifle and put them out there with uniforms and had them walk the sand dunes. Locally, the headquarters for the Coast Guard Beach Patrol is this, I think they call it the Coral Casino at the Biltmore. Have you ever seen that little building? So at the Biltmore on the beach, it's called the Coral Casino. It's really a nice vintage building. And that was the Coast Guard Beach Patrol's headquarters for this area. So basically, that's just some of my stuff from my little Coast Guard museum.
Oh, that's very nice. Thank you very much. People wrote letters then,
Yeah.
you know, as opposed to texting.
Rick,
Yeah.
what's your last name?
Manzer, M-A-N-Z-E-R.
Rick's folks used to run the Lotzenhauser's stationery store in
Oh,
town.
yeah.
Yeah.
Rick, you're still in business doing what?
Well, I still have the company, and I sell paper that doesn't decay, doesn't turn yellow, doesn't get old and brittle, and I sell it primarily to government agencies for minutes of city council meetings.
Oh.
Cemeteries buy product from me for records, so this stuff these burial records will be accessible centuries from now. And I sell fancy binders that you can store them in. And I have a website called minutebooks.com. That's how the world finds me.
Thank you, that was really nice.
Steve, we'd like to thank you for doing the talk, I guess. Hooch.
No Applejack,
Okay.
no Applejack.
And anyone wishing to ask Steve some more questions, he'll be up here. Thank you very much. We're
Yeah.
gonna have him, I
Buy
arranged
Steve,
that,
buy
he'll be here
Steve
for
lunch?
Veterans Day.
That's for the museum.
November.
Well, it was, glad it's over with.
Whoever gets the big lunch.
Oh, yeah.
Yep.